Now the Archive Hour, and this week marks the 30th anniversary of a revolution in parliamentary broadcasting. It was April the 3rd, 1978, when we began to hear the House of Commons on a regular basis for the first time.
30 years ago this week, Parliament was broadcast for the first time on radio on a regular basis. I'm John Sargent, and I remember it well. As a BBC correspondent, I was fully conscious that Parliament was giving way to a new era. There would be no going back to the time when broadcasters would merely quote the great speeches. They could be heard by everyone. The fusty atmosphere of a gentleman's club, yes, they were mainly gentlemen, was open to a blast of democratic air. The rituals were exposed for good and ill. Parliamentary life would never be quite the same. In this programme, we look back at some of the highs and lows of the past 30 years of radio and later television Westminster. And we ask the big question, how much did it really matter? The regular radio broadcasts began on the 3rd of April 1978, but in 1975 there was a 4-week trial run. So instead of just the sound of Big Ben on the airwaves from Westminster, we had...
Well, good afternoon from the chamber of the House of Commons and to the first live broadcast on Radio 4 of two of the Commons rituals. They are the Prime Minister's Question Time and the Business Question. Now, the Prime Minister answers questions every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon.
Members in this government, as indeed there were in previous governments I headed, than has been the practice under the governments of other parties. And this is, I think, the first cabinet, is it not, that has 2 women cabinet members. I look forward to more.
I know what that means. MPs will have to work it out.
Mrs. Thatcher.
Inevitably, everyone's waiting for her, a great cheer for her.
As some people in public affairs are capable of cutting through the trivia to the real problems of the nation, may I, as a woman in public affairs...
Prime Minister Harold Wilson and the then Leader of the Opposition, Margaret Thatcher, in the first live broadcast of Prime Minister's Questions. The Labour veteran, Tony Benn, was the first Cabinet Minister to be heard by the public answering questions in the House of Commons. He was the Industry Secretary.
In view of the decisive rejection by the British people last week of one of his other crackpot proposals, should he not resign?
Mr. Benn, back to his seat again.
Well, I don't think I need explain to the House the government's commitment to the implementation of its election programme, which it put before the people twice last year and upon which it was elected. And
Jim Hancock was a political reporter on Piccadilly Radio in Manchester.
At 2:30 on the famous day, I think it was Andy Peebles was the disc jockey at the time, the music ceased. Luckily we had a personality at the dispatch box that most people knew, but it was on a fairly obscure matter of industrial policy, but there it was. So, you know, I won't overdo this, but the nation was sort of waiting to hear this. After prayers, up came the microphones, and there for the first time you heard the House of Commons.
In fact, after the broadcast, the headlines in papers included The Sun, Big Ben is the star of the air. Financial Times, Commons Radio starts with sparking Ben cut and thrust. Daily Telegraph, Ben a hit in Radio Commons. Tony Benn has been giving me his reflections on the importance of parliamentary broadcasting, and he recalls that first encounter to be heard by the public.
I was sacked that afternoon by Wilson.
Really?
Yes, that was the very same day. You see, it was the last speech I ever made as Secretary for Industry. But it was interesting to be the first person answering questions in the House of Commons. And, of course, the event was reported as a first. I don't know whether much of what I said in answering questions was there, but it was a memorable day, for me especially.
A thrill.
I don't get thrilled. I mean, you try and put your case as best you can. I'm sorry if I don't go through these emotional excitements that obviously hit you in the newsroom. You must have had a lot of fun being thrilled as often as you were.
Well, we're thrilled. It seems so natural now, but why did it take so long for the microphones to be allowed into Westminster? Professor Asa Briggs is the author of The Official History of the BBC.
Right at the very beginning of the BBC, in the old days indeed of the British Broadcasting Company in the 1920s, It was mooted by Reith that they should use microphones for broadcasting the King's speech to Parliament at the opening of Parliament, and in the following year that they should broadcast the budget speech. So right at the very beginnings of broadcasting, the idea of broadcasting from Parliament was already there. And it was objected to by the Cabinet because, first of all, they didn't really believe that the BBC should be providing at that time an independent news service of its own. And secondly, because they believed it was intervening in the affairs of Parliament, which should be left to the government and the opposition to decide. I don't think the BBC was afraid of losing its independence in the very early discussions, which took place a little bit before the Second World War. But I think it was perhaps a bit afraid after the end of the war, with Sir William Hayley as Director General. It was felt that it was really the role of the Times and of newspapers to deal with current affairs on a regular basis, and not the role of the BBC. It was essentially under the Director Generalship of Ian Trethowan, much later, that Trethowan felt that it was his great ambition to have direct broadcasting from inside Parliament.
For years, the government argued that proceedings were far too technical to be understood by the ordinary listener. Better to let professional correspondents explain the mysteries of Parliament. Anthony Howard was a young political journalist in the 1950s.
The press gallery in my day was a kind of slum. I mean, the actual outside bit where you sat and listened to the debates wasn't too bad. But backstage, it really was pretty grotty. But I think that the conditions for studio interviews and things were very primitive indeed, and quite often they went over the road to Great College Street, where they had a kind of studio that I used to go to, which again was pretty primitive, in a kind of basement off the Abbey Garden, I think. But the first time I think I ever became aware that broadcasting Parliament was actually a political issue was in the end of 1959, when Aneurin Bevan, who was then Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, made his last speech to the House of Commons before he got cancer. And one of the things he came out for was the broadcasting of Parliament. I think in those days they had in mind radio only. But he said, and I hear him say, now, in this House we are becoming almost inarticulate, he said, because the public doesn't hear what we're saying. So I think that was quite a revolutionary suggestion, and certainly wasn't approved by Hugh Gaitskell, who was leader of the Labour Party. He was rather shocked at it being made.
But commentators in those days did their best to capture the mood of the moment. Here's Christopher Jones describing the scene in Parliament on the 28th of July, 1964, when Winston Churchill retired from the Commons.
Every seat in the House was taken, every seat except one. For as a silent but immensely eloquent tribute to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Woodford, the seat that he has occupied for the last few years was left empty. Beside the empty seat sat Mr. Harold Macmillan, and in the gallery above were Sir Winston's son, Mr. Randolph Churchill, and his daughter, Mrs. Mary Soames. The first tribute came from the Prime Minister, when he moved...
It's a period piece, isn't it, Tony, the way it's treated with such reverence by the commentator, Christopher Jones.
Well, that was a general attitude. I mean, in the old days, interviews were, could the Right Honourable Gentleman, could the Prime Minister explain to the audience his latest achievements, that. When Robin Day changed that, and Prime Minister's Questions has come back to that with backbenchers. But you see, the thing that hasn't come out so far, and why it was so important that Parliament should be broadcast, you're not dependent on a BBC chairman. The chairman is your own elected speaker, and the agenda is set by the business of the House. So if I put down a motion, as I did a couple of times, a motion of censure, it was called, and I wasn't dependent on satisfying the BBC that what it was interesting. I had, as an elected person, raised a matter, and they had to report it. And that, I think, was very, very important indeed. It wasn't just jealousy of the media. It was also a recognition that the House could be on its own without being entirely dependent upon what the BBC or the commentators would make of it.
So that's the paradox. The BBC were pushing for broadcasting. Some of the MPs thought, oh, don't give them the power. But as you say, in many ways, it returned power where it belonged, to the floor of the House of Commons.
That's right, and that's one of the reasons why I was strongly in favour of it. I think the people who opposed it didn't realise that.
One of those who fought to bring microphones into the Commons was Richard Crossman, the Leader of the House during the Wilson government in the mid-1960s. Anthony Howard remembers.
When Harold Wilson became Prime Minister in 1964, it didn't immediately come on the agenda, but when he appointed Dick Crossman, who was a genuine innovator, to be Leader of the House of Commons in, I think, 1966, Dick got the bit between his teeth and he wanted desperately to introduce the broadcasting of Parliament. And he took his recommendation to the Cabinet. In the Cabinet he could only, I think, collect 5 votes in favour, and easily the majority, led by the Prime Minister, were against any such sort of vulgar, popular suggestion as the broadcasting of Parliament. And poor Dick, because he was overawed by his failure in converting his Cabinet colleagues, had to go and, I think, both open and wind up the first debate, I believe, ever held on the broadcasting of Parliament, which was in 1968. And because he was very conscious of his responsibilities to his colleagues, he gave a very balanced speech, on the one hand, on the other, case for, case against, this kind of thing. And at the end of it, the House was rather bewildered because he presented the arguments on both sides so persuasively that he proceeded to vote by 131 votes to 130 against the broadcasting of Parliament. Dick was beside himself with grief. He said, I blew it, he said.
The former Liberal leader, David Steel, now Lord Steel, made a remarkable confession to us.
I can now confess that the late John Mackintosh, who was my next-door neighbour as a constituency, and I both went for the last plane back to Edinburgh thinking that the vote was secure, and in fact, had we stayed, it would have been carried then by 1 vote, instead of being lost by 1 vote, and radio broadcasting would have started much earlier. It was all my fault. I can plead guilty now.
Right, Tony Benn, the question immediately arises, do you share Lord Steele's feeling that, oh, if only...
Well, I would have liked to have seen it earlier still. Mind you, the link between a constituency MP and their own constituents is so much more important than listening to parliamentary debates. And I think it's a great mistake to think of MPs simply in terms of what they say in Parliament. Because remember, if you're watching Parliament being broadcast, you can't ask a question yourself. You're a spectator. And it's only when you're dealing with your own local MP you elect and can remove that you become more than a spectator, you become a participant.
The broadcasters, surprisingly, were not always champing at the bit to broadcast proceedings. Ian McIntyre was the controller of BBC Radio 4 in the 70s, and he wasn't keen. The BBC's historian, Asa Briggs.
McIntyre said on one famous occasion that it was not a requirement in the charter of the BBC that it should advance the cause of democracy. The people who were primarily concerned with radio didn't want to have Radio 4 turned essentially into a news service with extremely strong, regular, on-roll debating from inside Parliament. Because, in fact, radio knew that its most influential daily programmes were programmes like Afternoon Theatre, Listen with Mother, Woman's Hour, and if in fact you broadcast Parliament instead, even Question Time, you would somehow or other be losing the richness and variety of Radio 4.
Asa Briggs. Conservative backbencher Sir Nicholas Winterton and the former Labour Foreign Secretary Margaret Beckett were among MPs with reservations.
I thought it might be used by members of Parliament really as a theatre, as a platform to make an impression with the public, rather to engage in what I would call very serious debate upon issues which are of critical importance to the country. To an extent, that has happened, but as time has gone by, I believe it has been extremely helpful in getting Parliament better understood by the people out in the street, the electorate of this country.
I was a little concerned, perhaps, about just radio broadcasting of the House of Commons. And certainly I remember thinking when television came in that it would be better because there was so much that you don't understand if you can't see it. Like, for example, what's extremely relevant is not so much what somebody asks, but who's asking it. You know, a hostile question from your own side is a very different matter from a hostile question from the other side. And it worried me a little bit as to whether or not people would therefore really get a clear picture as opposed to kind of half a picture.
There was a definite public thirst for access to Parliament, as the former Labour Cabinet Minister turned Lib Dem peer, Shirley Williams, recalls.
The referendum on the membership of the European Civil Community at that time was held in the open, so thousands of people came. And what that made parliamentarians think, the public was bypassing them because it could suddenly find it could be there, it could be part of it. And that, I think, changed quite a lot of attitudes, because literally, I'm not exaggerating when saying that it was not uncommon to have 3,000 people at a meeting in Bristol or Newcastle or wherever it might be. I don't know why so many came, but thousands came. And so the message that went back to the Commons was, you're being bypassed. This is the thing they really want to be part of. And I think that led people to think more kindly about the idea of radio and television.
Anthony Howard remembers exactly when he was converted to the idea of the broadcasting of Parliament.
On the 17th of June, 1963, I was a young lobby journalist, and I was up there in the press gallery, and by arrangement, Robin Day was out in Parliament Square giving a blow-by-blow account, as it were, of the debate on the Perfumer affair, which was going on. And it struck me as ludicrous. It was a wet day. There was I in Parliament Square under an umbrella held by some BBC functionary and saying, well, the Prime Minister's just got up. I wouldn't say he was greeted with a warm cheer, but it was a cheer, and he's just started his speech. And it suddenly struck me this was ludicrous. Here we were in a democracy, and here was I, the messenger boy, coming down the lift from the press gallery in the House of Commons to go and stand in the rain in Parliament Square and tell the British public what was going on in their own elected chamber, and from that moment on I was converted to the broadcasting of Parliament.
Eventually live radio transmissions did begin. The momentous day was April the 3rd, 1978. Jim Hancock was a lobby correspondent for Independent Radio News.
You were right at the heart of the action, and MPs were excited by this because it also generated a whole generation of programmes, like IRN had Decision Makers, and we had LBC, London Speaks, and an MP would come in and you'd play the clips and they would discuss what had gone on in Parliament. So it wasn't just the recorded clips, but it opened up the whole resource of Parliament, that you could actually have programmes which commented on it.
Parliament had to adapt too.
Mr. Speaker, have you any way of restraining the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Civil Service in giving such long answers? Because on the important question of number 27, on the job for young people, you were not able to call a supplementary on our side of the House at all.
Order. It may be my imagination, but I am under the impression that questions and answers have been longer today, and I cannot understand the reason why.
The Speaker at the time, George Thomas. Opinions differ on the significance of the change.
The controversy was one of those controversies that died down almost immediately. Everybody knew that no MP would ever have the nerve to suggest that you went back to throwing the broadcasters out, and by the time we had the next Parliament elected, it was just routine parliamentary life.
I thought Margaret Thatcher benefited inordinately from the fact that people could hear her freely and effectively answering all these disparate questions and hadn't got the faintest idea at the time, when it was just radio, that she'd got this huge book of briefing in front of her and was reading from or drawing on the briefing. They just thought she was answering all this off the cuff.
Those who can get over their comments in one or two lines do very well.
I remember Jim Callaghan saying to me, he was Prime Minister, and said, "What's the problem, Jim?" He says, "We've got all these Tories heckling me. Do you think it has an effect?" I said, "Yes, it does. On radio, they can't hear the heckling, so don't respond. It's just background noise."
And it is right that the great British public should be able to listen to those debates and should know what the results are. When people argue against it, I said, well, OK, they can switch off if they don't like it.
The former Conservative cabinet ministers Ken Clarke and Kenneth Baker, Margaret Beckett, the backbencher Dennis Skinner, and the former Speaker of the House, Betty Boothroyd. What about Margaret Beckett's point, though, that what it meant was if people didn't see the briefing papers that were prepared for Margaret Thatcher, for example, they would get a false impression of incredible eloquence and knowledge, but of course helped by the fact that she was looking at it from a file in front of her?
I don't think there's much in that. I don't think making a speech from notes helps at all. The speeches that really register the people that come from the heart. You can always tell. Do they know what they're talking about? Do they believe what they're saying? Why are they saying it? Why are they saying it to me? Why are they saying it to me now? And if you've got all those impressions, it does matter much more than whether the words read easily afterwards, having been written by a civil servant or spin doctor.
What about the relative power, though, of government and opposition? Radio broadcasting was then meant inevitably that the leader of the opposition, for example, would be heard on exactly the same level and given the same importance as the Prime Minister. That's a difference, isn't it?
Well, I think every MP has got to be treated in the same way, because even the Prime Minister has only got into Parliament because his own constituency elected him. This idea of a hierarchy...
Sure, but broadcasting would emphasise that point, wouldn't it?
I suppose it would to some extent, but I think you judge people when you listen to them not by how important they are, but by whether what they're saying illuminates the problem you're discussing. If you do that, you can't go far wrong.
One obvious effect of the microphones was that the role of the speaker could finally be appreciated by the public. Indeed, the speakers became personalities in their own right. MPs of all parties were moved at the election of Betty Boothroyd as Speaker in 1992.
I do remember so well. I can remember I wore a red silk dress and I was dragged to the chair with the late John Biffin and Gwyneth Dunwoody, and I can see it all now. It was a great occasion. And of course it was the very first time that members in the House of Commons applauded. They had no order papers to wave, so they applauded, and the sun came through the windows and shone on me, and I felt very good indeed.
Well, I took part in that debate. I spoke in support of Betty Boothroyd and made a speech about the speakership. And the thing about that debate was it was the first time the Speaker was actually elected in the House of Commons and not done by what's called the usual channels. I referred to the usual channels as the most polluted waterway in Europe. And it did highlight the importance of the Speaker, which, in the light of the broadcasting, was so very relevant, because the role of the Speaker in Parliament is enormously important, and normally the Speaker was never mentioned. But the Speaker's intervention, what subjects they pick, who do they call, who do they not call, is very, very important. And Betty was a wonderful Speaker, and I'm very proud that I spoke. I did point out that hitherto we've been entirely dependent on Mr. Speaker Paxman, and on the whole I preferred the Speaker of the House of Commons deciding who's going to be called and what they can say.
And broadcasting, of course, enhanced the role of the Speaker enormously.
They became public figures, very highly respected. Jack Weatherall was a wonderful speaker, and Betty Boothroyd was a wonderful speaker, and I think Michael Martin's the first backbencher speaker I've ever known. I saw him and his wife in the tea room, I never heard of before. Previously, the Speaker wandered round like a monarch, surrounded by functionaries, but the present Speaker is a very, very good example of a people's Speaker, backbencher Speaker.
Not everybody would agree with you about the Speaker, very controversial figure.
Well, they voted for him, so you can't complain about that. That's known as democracy, which I suppose we were meant to be fighting for.
Within months of the microphones being allowed in on a regular basis for the first time, the Labour government was in trouble with the winter of discontent, and in March 1979 they faced a vote of no confidence. Amazingly, just before the vote was lost, Michael Foot made a very witty speech, one of his best.
And what the Right Honourable Lady has done, and I've seen it, marked it myself, what she is doing today is leading her troops into battle, snugly concealed behind a Scottish nationalist shield, with the boy David holding her hand. I must say to the Right Honourable Lady, who, I'd like her to smile for once. I'd like her to smile. I say to perhaps I could say to the Right Honourable Lady, I'm even more concerned about the fate of the Right Honourable Gentleman than I am about her. She can look after herself. But here, the leader of the Liberal Party, I say this in the utmost affection, but he's He's passed from rising hope to elder statesman without any intervening period whatsoever.
Joking under pressure, but the cause was lost.
Order. The ayes to the right, 311. The noes to the left, 310. So the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, now that the House of Commons has declared itself, we shall take our case to the country.
Of course, the boy David Michael Foot was referring to was the young Liberal leader David Steel, at 40, even younger than his party's present leader. He joined the writer Michael Dobbs, an advisor to Margaret Thatcher at the time, to look back on those dramatic events.
I remember sitting in Margaret Thatcher's office at the time, just behind the Speaker's chair, with some of her closest aides, and we were listening to the broadcast of proceedings. And we heard through the broadcast that one Labour whip had come back into the chamber and had raised his thumb, which the radio broadcasters immediately assumed was a sign of victory. There was an outpouring of venom and swearing, actually. I mean, there was some pretty foul language emanating from around Maggie Thatcher's office for the few seconds that we thought we'd lost that night. Of course, the broadcasters had got it wrong, the Labour whip had got it wrong, and Maggie had won.
The Labour Party went on in government through that winter of 78-79 without a parliamentary majority, and through what became known as the winter of discontent, and the Labour government became very, very unpopular. So when there was a motion which they were likely to be defeated 6 months later, the pressure building up that night, people coming in ambulances to vote, Irishmen being pursued as to whether they were coming to abstain or to vote. Genuinely, here was a debate taking place where nobody knew the outcome until the people went into the lobbies. So it was a very extraordinary, really extraordinary occasion.
A vote of no confidence, lost by one vote, the government falls, and that's the first time that the public can hear those proceedings from Parliament broadcast directly.
Yes, it was in its own way as decisive as a general election, and it was a very dramatic occasion.
And it's somehow typical of the House of Commons that Michael Foot in that position, in fact a departing member of the Cabinet as it turned out, making this brilliantly funny speech, joking under pressure.
Well, Michael's a great parliamentary performer, no question about that, and he did a little bit of humour, so long as it's not disrespectful, does carry the day. And people appreciate that, because we're all human as well as being elected.
But that is the theatre of the House of Commons, isn't it? And broadcasting got across to people the first time that jokes were in order, even at a most amazing moment like that.
Well, I mean, humour's a very popular and relevant way of getting your case across, and Michael used it to good effect. But the one word I object to is theatre. Once you say Parliament's a theatre, then abandon the politics. Who's doing well, who's doing badly, who's going up, who's going down, and that destroys confidence in Parliament and politics.
All right, but dramatic moments, plenty of them. Just 2 days after the vote of no confidence in March 1979, MPs were winding up business ahead of a general election. Airy Neave, a Conservative MP very close to Mrs Thatcher and a potential future cabinet minister, was blown up in his car by a terrorist bomb just yards from the chamber.
And I'm sure that is the proper way in which the problem should be approached, because it's not essentially a credit union matter, it is a taxation matter, and one's obviously got to consider the treatment of credit unions.
With deepest regret, I have to inform the House that an explosion has occurred within the precincts of the Palace, which has involved a car and a person as yet unidentified who has sustained serious injury, although the extent of these is not yet known.
The fall of the Callaghan government led to the election of Britain's first woman Prime Minister. Prime Minister's Question Time, twice a week, became the focus of essential listening and later viewing, and not just in Britain. Here's Neil Kinnock.
I was coming through JFK Airport in mid-80s. We walked through the lounge, my wife and myself, and a little boy, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy, it's Neil Kinnock." And I turned around and I thought, my God, I mean, that is quite extraordinary. I was stunned. And I said to his mother, a very pleasant woman, I said, how on earth does a 7-year-old, which is what he was, know who I am? And she said, C-SPAN. And this family avidly watched public service broadcasting that used to broadcast wholesale the quarter of an hour of Prime Minister's questions and then repeat highlights. Mrs. T was very famous in any case, obviously, but the idea that my face should be known was quite bizarre indeed. And the reason for it was the fact that we were at each other's throats twice a week.
But there are still critics of the broadcasting of Prime Minister's questions.
Many members of the public now would think that the only thing that happens in Parliament is Prime Minister's question time. The focus on it is absolutely extraordinary. Prime Minister's question time is a very untypical part of the parliamentary week. It's very entertaining, and I don't blame broadcasters for taking it at all, but it'd be nice to have a wider balance of what actually takes place.
I mean, it used to be the case that the leader of the opposition, for that matter the leader of the Liberals, would ask searching questions of the Prime Minister with a view to establishing some point of actual policy. Now it's simply a competition in sound bites. Can you catch them out? Can you insult them more effectively across the floor than you did last week? And I think that has diminished politics.
Lord Steele and the former Labour MP Bruce Grocott, now Lord Grocott. In that area, I suppose the critics were right. They were worried that the broadcasters would concentrate on Prime Minister's question time, and broadly speaking, that's what the broadcasters have done.
Prime Minister's questions gives you less idea of what's really being debated than almost any serious debate, but it provides things that enormously appeal to the media and their coverage. And of course now we have a new situation that government backbenchers don't ask questions at all. They say, could I trouble my right honourable friend to remind the House of his triumph since last Wednesday? And as somebody said, there's so many planted questions, it ought to be called Gardener's question time. And it doesn't help Parliament. I think
that was
it's the
your
most
joke,
damaging
Tony.
bit. Pardon?
That sounds like a Tony Benn joke.
Well, it's true. I mean, people get up and say what they like. It becomes a sort of press conference. But this is what I feel about the media. If I come to you for a moment, you see, all these correspondents who stand outside number 10 and say we understand the government's mind, they've been told 10 minutes earlier at the lobby meeting. They're embedded correspondents like the guys in the war who come out from talking to a general and say the war's going very well. And I think we've lost from that, but it's not directly related to the broadcasting of Parliament. It shows how power has shifted from Parliament to the media.
But what about this business that Prime Minister's questions are still amazingly important, in one sense at least, that if you are the leader of an opposition party, you are very much judged to this day on how well you perform at Prime Minister's questions. And that finished off Ming Campbell, it's finished off leaders of the Tory party. It's still in that sense extremely relevant.
I think there is a media judgment of it myself. I think people listening will judge it as to whether they think it's a good question, not whether it was a parliamentary triumph.
One of the most important moments to be captured by the microphones came in 1982, the then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that the whole House will join me in condemning totally this unprovoked aggression by the government of Argentina against British territory. It has not a shred of justification and not a scrap of legality.
One of the effects of broadcasting was the exposure it gave to rebel MPs. Scotland's First Minister, Alex Salmond, found himself suspended during the budget of 1988.
This means that the basic rate of income tax and the corporation tax rate for small companies will both be at their lowest level since the war. Life assurance premium relief remains in place.
I'd read the Commons rules backwards, forwards, and I realised that there was no particular reason you shouldn't intervene in the middle of a budget statement. So I determined, as an MP of few months standing, that I would intervene in the middle of Nigel Lawson's budget statement, just at the bit where he was coming to the tax cuts for the upper earners. In the chair was a Labour member from Yorkshire, a tough wee guy called Harold Walker. He wasn't going to allow me to rain on the budget parade. And what I remember is, in this incredible atmosphere of kind of astonishment combined with huge noise and uproar, that Nigel Lawson sort of turned to the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, and although I couldn't hear anything, it seemed to me like his lips said something like, "This is terrible." So I remember thinking, well, if that's what he thinks, there might be an argument for pursuing this a bit longer. That's exactly what I did.
name, Mr. Alex Salmon.
I suppose the question is, Tony Benn, did in fact behaviour in the House generally, did it get worse because of broadcasting, or was it much the same?
I don't know. There's a lot of difference, really. I mean, there have been occasions. I was thinking, I think when Manny Shinwell was first elected, some Conservative, I think his name was Commander Bauer, I'm not absolutely sure, made some reference which Manny Shinwell took to imply anti-Semitism. He went across and struck Commander Bauer on the face. Then there was the lovely occasion when Bernadette Devlin crossed the House and struck Maudling on the face.
Then Chancellor Exchequer.
Yes, Chancellor Exchequer. And somebody said it almost woke Reggie Maudling up. And then there were people like Heseltine ran off with the mace, Ron Brown. I mean, we're a human organisation. I think if it's thought to be a show-off, people don't like it. But passions are high. I mean, big issues are raised. And so I don't think that if you see somebody lose their temper genuinely, that would alter your view. It might make you think, well, thank God somebody said it.
But did it make MPs behave better? I mean, I suppose the example people think of is MPs often drink in the evening in the House of Commons. Hansard would always cover this up. Can't always cover up a broadcast when a minister has had too much to drink. Alan Clark, on a famous occasion as a minister, clearly had too much to drink, and it was broadcast.
Well, on one occasion, Tony Crossan forgot his parliamentary notes, and everybody knew he'd forgotten because the questions came much quicker than expected. So in every answer to every question, he said, it's a very good point. I asked my honourable friend to allow me to think, but everyone was laughing, but they knew he'd forgotten to bring his official answer.
But on the straightforward point, did MPs' behaviour improve or get worse because of broadcasting?
I don't think it changed at all.
Scotland's First Minister, Alex Salmond.
The television producers who were arguing for televising had to produce a replica of the 1988 budget intervention using wee wooden figures like wooden tops to demonstrate how they would deal with a serious disruptive threat like Salmond, and he wouldn't get any advantage out of it.
The idea of televising the proceedings of the House of Commons still caused considerable controversy in 1988.
I do not think television will ever televise this House. If they do televise it, they will only televise a televised House, which will be quite different from the House of Commons we've known.
Broadcasting this House with moving pictures. What is the Prime Minister afraid of?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, but the right honourable gentleman really gives me my point. The reputation of this House has not been enhanced by sound broadcasting.
Neil Kinnock and Margaret Thatcher. And here's the former leader of the Lib Dems, Charles Kennedy.
When the Select Committee on Televising went to Canada and spoke to the equivalents of the Nick Robinsons of that time over there in Canadian broadcasting, they explained to us how it would change the way in which political stories were packaged. And in fact, we hadn't heard the term soundbite, get things down to 12-second clips. And quite a lot of us looked at each other in incredulity and thought, no, this might be the way the Canadians or the Yanks might do things. This won't happen in Britain. Well, of course, look what's happened. 20 years later, very much so.
In 1990, the proceedings were finally televised on a regular basis. TV saw one of Margaret Thatcher's former colleagues, Sir Geoffrey Howe, deliver an astonishing attack on her only yards from where the Prime Minister was sitting. It electrified millions of viewers. Soon afterwards, Michael Heseltine felt he had no option but to challenge her in a ballot of Conservative MPs.
I remember Geoffrey Howe's speech, because it was an epoch-making speech. It ended with words to the effect that others must decide how to take the matter forward. Well, I don't know whether Geoffrey would say this or not, but there was only one person in the chamber to whom that remark applied like an arrow to the heart, and that was me. And I knew it, and I think everybody knew it, and that was the point at which I had to decide whether I would challenge Mrs. Thatcher for the leadership of the party. Nobody could have known that Geoffrey would rise to that occasion in such a remarkable way, but he did. But the consequence of it, for me, was, of course, dramatic and immediate.
Mr. Speaker, I believe that both the Chancellor and the Governor are cricketing enthusiasts. So I hope there's no monopoly of cricketing metaphors. It's rather like sending your opening batsman to the crease, only for them to find, the moment the first balls are bowled, that their bats have been broken before the game by the team captain.
It was the first occasion of its kind that was being televised. We'd only just started on television a few weeks before, I think. And because I was invited to make my statement as an opening statement rather than in the debate that was taking place, I spoke quite early in the afternoon, so that the whole thing was available for rebroadcast on every television channel that night. And it did therefore make a tremendous impact. Almost nobody had failed to see it. But clearly it was going to be a shock for Margaret. She had said as much when I handed my resignation letter to her. She tried to persuade me that I needn't resign. And then she read my letter and she said, "Yes, well, I see you have no alternative." So she wasn't surprised by the case that I presented.
Lord Howe. One of the most memorable moments was Margaret Thatcher's farewell speech just hours after she had resigned as Prime Minister in November 1990. Alan Beith, the Liberal Democrats' former deputy leader, asked a question which was in turn interrupted by Dennis Skinner.
Fight against a single currency and an independent central bank when she leaves office.
No, she's going to be the governor.
On the present structure...
Order. The Prime Minister.
What a good idea.
It was fantastic. I have to say the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I actually tingled. To me it was a desperately sad moment because she had been a fantastic Prime Minister of this country. It was an occasion. She was at her best. And when she was at the peak of her authority, and she was on that occasion, she dominated the House. It was an occasion when you had to be there, and I was there, and I was delighted to be there.
So I'll consider the honourable gentleman's proposal. Now, where were we? I'm enjoying this.
It was difficult for me because, obviously, I'd put down a motion of no confidence in the government, which would make it increasingly evident that the leader of the government, the leader of the Conservative Party, was stranded, as Mrs. Thatcher indeed was. What I hadn't envisaged was that eventually she would bottle out and give up the fight and resign as Prime Minister, with the resignation effective from the end of the day on which we were to debate this motion of no confidence, and use the fact that she was being broadcast to great effect.
It is just one of the great moments of Parliament that I can remember, certainly, where she's funny, it's poignant, and everyone present realises that this is a great moment of history.
That's right. So she was a Prime Minister who was dead in the water, and she made this tremendously valiant speech, and she was looking at her legacy, I suppose, in a sense. She wanted to go out with a bang, and that was very dramatic.
Yes, but do you think it made it possible for her, because everyone saw excerpts, at least, of that speech, to leave office with more dignity than she might have had otherwise?
That was her intention. And she presented her case in retrospect with as much passion and power as she could, and insofar as people had greatly admired what she'd done and her legacy, they liked that. People who took a contrary view tended to say, well, good riddance. And those are two political reactions to what was a very important occasion in the House. And whatever, I think her policies were catastrophic. But she said what she meant and meant what she said, and you have to give her credit for that.
So television and radio now captured all the dramas in public life that affected Parliament.
With permission, Madam Speaker, I wish to inform the House that Buckingham Palace are at this moment issuing the following statement. It reads as follows. It is announced from Buckingham Palace that, with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate.
And the House of Commons is a very human thing. There are an awful lot of components of it, but there is a human consciousness almost about it.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I'm grateful that you agreed to the recall of Parliament to debate the hideous and foul events in New York, Washington and Pennsylvania that took place on Tuesday, the 11th of September.
There is no doubt whatsoever that when John Smith died, completely unexpectedly, and the House met in the afternoon, the emotion was everywhere, and the speeches matched the occasion.
When I think of John Smith, I think of an opponent, not an enemy. And when I remember him, I shall do so with respect and with affection. And when I think of his premature death...
Why would anyone bother to go into politics unless it's to speak up for people who can't speak up for themselves.
I mean, I suppose for me, having to do the tribute to John Smith was one of the most traumatic and very dramatic. I have never, before or since, known the house so sombre. I actually didn't know if I could get through it. He was such a lovely man. I mean, the public perception, as I think I said in my remarks, he looked like a sort of rather solemn bank manager. He wasn't a bit like that. And, you know, all sorts of unlikely people who didn't agree with him at all politically from various different points of view just thought he was great.
They were almost the last words I heard him say. He looked at the assembled gathering and he said, and I quote, "The opportunity to serve our country. That is all we ask." Let it stand as his epitaph.
What other moments can you remember from this period where, well, the House was gripped by emotion, I suppose?
Well, Eric Heffer was very ill. He and I had been colleagues over a long period, and he was confined to his flat in London. But when we had a debate, he wanted to come over. It was about the Middle East. And he came over, and I greeted him and brought him to his place in the House, very, very poorly. And he spoke, and it was heard in absolute silence, because everybody knew he was dying. And he sat down, and the Prime Minister came across John Major, across the floor of the House, and shook him by the hand. And that was very moving, because that was the human side. You mustn't confuse the human side of political discourse with the political passion. I mean, sometimes people think you insult each other all the time and then go and have dinner. Well, that's not the case. But you put forward your view, but that doesn't prevent an ordinary human contact based on mutual respect. And Eric won respect because he was known to say what he thinks.
More recently, the House reacted to Tony Blair's departure last June.
To all my colleagues from different political parties, some may belittle politics, but we know, who are engaged in it, that it is where people stand tall. And although I know it has its many harsh contentions, it is still the arena that sets the heart beating a little faster. And if it is on occasions the place of low skullduggery, it is more often the place for the pursuit of noble causes. And I wish everyone, friend or foe, well, and that is that, the end.
The MP with the distinction of asking the last question of Tony Blair was the current father of the House, the Labour MP Alan Williams. What was it like?
Formidable, when you saw this wall of faces opposite you, and very emotional. As I said on the day, regardless of what different people felt about his performance as Prime Minister on particular issues, and I disagreed with him on Iraq and so on. He had done something, as I said, no one had ever done before. Not Harold couldn't do it, Jim Callaghan couldn't do it, Attlee couldn't do it. 3 successive elections and 10 successive years in government. He deserved recognition for it, and I wanted to spell that out.
Whose reputation, then, has been enhanced by the broadcasting of Parliament? Here's Lord Briggs.
Well, I think one man whose reputation depended a great deal on his success in Parliament was William Hague. It's true that he made his first success on a platform, the Conservative Party conference, but his skill at question time in opposition and his way of addressing the country through direct access to Parliament, I think has been very substantial. I think that probably he's the best case of somebody whose reputation has been enhanced by direct broadcasting from Parliament.
Dispatch box and say so now. Well, Madam Speaker, he doesn't want to read out the figures because the figures show that the class sizes have risen. And he promised smaller class sizes to the whole country in all class sizes. It's even written on one of his famous mugs. It was written on the... Showing one of the mugs. Smaller class sizes, it says. Doesn't say for 5, 6, 7-year-olds. Doesn't say that. I know he wants to see the back of his mugs, but he'll have to wait for the reshuffle for that. doesn't say...
Order! I want to see the mug and hear what the honourable gentleman...
Madam Speaker, there it is. The Prime doesn't say 5, 6. All it says on the bottom is this product needs warm, soapy water.
Giving way to a new era of broadcasting from Parliament hasn't pleased everyone. The Lib Dems Cyril Smith, Margaret Beckett and the former Cabinet Minister Patrick Jenkin.
I think if I walked in the street and said, "What do you think about the House of Commons today?" I think most of them would say, "Well, we don't know out about it, really."
There is no resemblance, almost, between the way Parliament was reported when I was first elected and the way it's reported now, because there is hardly any coverage of what Parliament actually says.
I think the soundbite is actually the enemy of public understanding.
Here's Sir Bernard Ingham, Margaret Thatcher's former press secretary.
Televised political programmes are not concentrating on the House of Commons, they're concentrating on their own agenda. And much of that agenda is to examine conflict of ideas. Now, I'm not saying that that's bad, but it's taken the debate out of the House of Commons and put it into a studio.
Here's Michael White, journalist with The Guardian and former parliamentary sketchwriter.
Well, of course, radio didn't have a dedicated channel in the way that television later did. But I think as it came on board, it gave the newspapers, which were under intense competition from each other, an excuse to drop their parliamentary reporting. The fact that you could get it on a television feed made them feel they were under no obligation to provide that sort of coverage. So the coverage became more lobby coverage, what the government's doing, and of course these fitted in with trends of the time anyway. Mrs. Thatcher and Tony Blair, powerful executive prime ministers, presidential, so it all was of a piece, and the losers on both sides were the backbenchers, the people whose speeches have been reported, perhaps only 100 words. I was the parliamentary sketchwriter in those days, spent hours in the chamber, and I look back on it with some affection and never mind spending time in. In fact, I don't watch it on the TV when I'm in the building. You've got to be there and see the reaction. You just can't see the figure on camera in isolation. You pick up the heckles, you pick up the mood.
Jim Hancock.
One has the facility to actually hear what the politicians are saying, and very often editors seem to want to substitute political commentary for that, you know. I mean, obviously there's a place for analysis of what's going on in Parliament, but, you know, sometimes you cannot beat the authentic voice of the MP.
And now Nick Robinson, the BBC's current political editor.
There's undoubtedly a danger that those people who are very media savvy, who know how to boil their views down into a catchy, sometimes deliberately provocative statement, and to do it briefly, get more coverage than the expert who doesn't bother with those skills. The tradition of the political reporter or correspondent was a parliamentary reporter first and foremost, reporting on what happened in Parliament. Increasingly, politics is not seen through that prism, seen through the prism of international affairs, seen through the prism of what happens in Downing Street, and that is a reflection of what's happened in the world, that more power is exercised from number 10, it matters more how it's exercised globally, and therefore, as many MPs complain, the number of occasions on which Parliament is at the centre of national debate is smaller. But in my relatively short time doing this sort of job, there have been some really significant parliamentary occasions that have got significant coverage. Not just obviously the build-up to the Iraq War, but also the debates over things like tuition fees. Another example, of course, is the debate about 90-day detention, in which the arguments made on those green benches and on the red benches too have genuinely shaped the national mood. Does that happen as often as members of Parliament and peers would like it to happen? No, but that's life.
Looking now at the whole issue, Tony Benn, do you think that the microphones and the cameras, has that been good for the relationship between the politicians and the broadcasters and the voters?
Better than not having it, but the media do not cover politics. I mean, for example, they never cover public meetings. They send a camera there for a scuffle or an arrest. And they even invited me to do a programme a while back about the death of public meetings. I said I'd love to do it, because I've done 5 last week and 10 the month before.
But
and they never
normal.
cover public meetings. And so I judge good political broadcasting, whether it covers what actually happened. I tell you, I did one thing. I got permission once to video my whole surgery. I said to them, look, it'll never be used. I can't, because it was confidential. But that's where all MPs get their information from their constituencies. And that's never covered. The spectator sport of watching the powerful is a part of it, but it's a fraction of what it could be if there was a real coverage of political debate.
But the reputation of MPs has gone down, for whatever reason, since the broadcasting of Parliament. As it happens, people think less of their politicians.
Well, let me answer that very straightforward. You say, what do you think of MPs? They say exactly what you say. What's your MP like? Oh, he's great. He turned up at our meeting. What's your experience of the health service? It's rubbish. What about your operation? Oh, they were wonderful. You see, I think spreading cynicism is one of the media's functions, to spread they're all the same, they're all a lot of bunch of crooks. And actually, not that the comparison is perhaps fair, the reputation of journalists is lower than MPs. And you see, the MP's work is never, ever, ever reported.
Well, can we end on a more cheerful note?
Yes, of course.
Tony, because 30 years of broadcasting of Parliament, a little cheer, surely?
Oh, of course, I argued for it strongly. I'm strongly in favour of it. But my experience of change, which I can reveal to you, if you come up with an idea to begin with, it's ignored. If you go on arguing for it, you're mad. I've had a touch of that myself. If you go on after that, you're dangerous. Then there's a pause, and then you can't find anyone at the top who doesn't claim to have thought of it in the first place. That is how all progress is made.
But if you take that point, that little story about change, at least you can say no one now could stop the broadcasting of Parliament.
Of course, a perfect example of it. I'm in favour of cabinet, not exactly being broadcast, but a press conference after it, a view that would be resisted, as you probably guess, by any known cabinet minister. But looking back on the cabinets I attended, I can't think any of them were really secret.
So that's another, 30 years' time. The broadcasting of Parliament, I'm pleased to say, has now become a never-ending stream. Let it never stop.
Prime Minister's remarkable transformation in the last few weeks from Stalin to Mr. Bean.
We have the courage of our convictions and are sticking to that promise. He has lost his courage, and that lot have lost their convictions.
Now, Mr. Speaker, if his party had really changed and moved to the centre, he'd be standing up to his backbenchers, he'd be leading them instead of following them. He'd be standing up to the Eurosceptics instead of appeasing them. He'd be moving to the centre of Europe instead of being left at the margins of Europe.
The producers were Rosemary Foxcroft and Ashley Byrne. Giving Way to a New Era was a Made in Manchester production for BBC Radio 4. And tomorrow night in the Westminster Hour, Carolyn Quinn will be discussing with political commentators Mr Brown's handling of complaints from his backbenchers. That's the Westminster Hour tomorrow night at 10. Liechtenstein is a tax haven in turmoil. German and British tax authorities are targeting the tiny Alpine Principality's secretive banks in search of billions of dollars in unpaid taxes. Alan Ury investigates why the country is resisting pressure to reform.
Why should we help finding a singular case?
Well, because you tell me you've got all these due diligence, know your customer regulations.
Exactly.
Well, so, all right, you know who the customer is, clearly, but you've got to know what they're up to as well, haven't you?
Yeah, because there's no obligation to ask if you pay taxes or not.
That's a pretty big loophole, isn't it?
Sure, it's a loophole. It's a loophole all around the world for every bank.
That's Tax Me If You Can, on Tuesday evening at 8.
BBC